Hi, thank you. So, thank you everyone for joining our session on wellbeing and economic impact. I'm delighted to have a brilliant panel with me today, Suranga, Katja, and Ricarda. So, today we'll be discussing everything from integrating wellbeing into company performance metrics through to how we can support founders better in the early days of a business's launch. So, I'll start by outlining why this topic is so important. So data tells us that a happy, healthy, engaged workforce is going to be a more productive workforce. Employees who look after their well-being don't take as many sick days, they don't use their vacation days for illness, and when they're at work, they're more focused. Now, these facts are well known, and yet I suspect there may be some CEOs and some founders in this room who forget those lessons for themselves. After all, in companies, we have structures like HR departments, we have peers, we have managers, we have company policies. But who looks after the lone figure at the top? Who cares for the carer? So, I'm going to start by coming to Katja. Obviously, I know that you wear many hats with many different roles. So how do you strike the balance between the many figures you have to play, and how do you measure internally when you're getting towards a period where you think you may burn out?
I was at that point. Is the mic on? I don't know. I was at that point many years ago, and that was before I did understand, what impacts me in terms of when do I get burned out and when do I thrive. And actually, I've been working in a SMB software company and in the largest hoster in Europe. Been a founder, a co-founder, now in a board of a fintech, which is 100% daughter of a corporate again. So I figured out, when you look at statistics, it's not only the workload, it's always mentioned as number one factor for burnout, but then often as number two factor is lack of control or lack of autonomy when you make your decisions. Although, in those statistics, another factor is constant change. So you have constant change and lack of control. How does that work together? And I figured out when I learned about my personality type that I'm an influencer or campaigner type. I like change, I embrace it. I get bored when I do the same thing all the time. But one of my dear colleagues, who's amazing in what he does, he's the opposite type, and he needs control, he needs a plan, he needs structure. So when I was at the point of a burnout, it was in an environment where I realized I can't make any decision that has impact towards the success of the company. And that actually was, for me, my learning is I need to find the environment where I, with my personality type, can thrive. And that is as well, for me, something very important that we all know, and I think probably everybody here knows their personality types, but what about your colleagues and your teams and your workforce, and do they know that from each other? So.
Yeah, and picking up that thought, Ricarda, of knowing your teams and your colleagues and what makes them tick. Obviously, you focus a lot on parenting and reintroducing parents back into the workforce. So what are the kind of flags you look for with your team? And how do you kind of internally measure how you're feeling amongst that?
Mm-hmm. So, honestly speaking, I was actually, when Steffi called me and said, this is the panel for you, these are the topics, I was kind of wondering why. And it's probably because I'm currently holding two hats. And one of them is I'm a founder of a startup, it's called MyCollective, and we do take care of parents, mainly women, on how they go through a parental, sort of a family creation time, and how this can sometimes be a career bummer, and we convert it into career booster. So it's great for them. I hope that there will be many more women in our industry in the leadership position, but it's also sometimes a bit of a burden. Mm-hmm. So I remember we have alumni meetings, and one of the most numerously visited ones just recently was on burnouts. And so in this session, our trainer and impulse sort of speaker went through a couple of early symptoms of burnout, and I was like, tick, yes, and I kind of had a lot of ticks, so now I'm thinking maybe Steffi was giving a bit of a subtle hint of why she invited me to this.
I'm sure it wasn't.
But I think there is a lot of pressure on specifically parents in the workforce. The higher they go, the more pressure there is. And maybe looking at it from a different perspective, the second role that I currently have, I've just recently taken on the role of CEO of a conference called Munich Management Colloquium. And it's in Munich, in the center of the technical university. So we unite industry and academia. And one thing that we discuss a lot is what this topic of well-being, what that means for our industry. And what it does mean, it means a lot of costs also. So you have, as Ted just recently published a figure of 6 billion euros per year that sick leave, as you mentioned, this is what it costs us as an industry. So in all of your businesses here, if ever any employee of you goes and has a burnout, depending on what kind of salary structure is in it, it's something between 50 and 100,000 per employee. So this is a cost for every company, and large companies can cover that, but startups, and if it's the founder, that quite often is the end of it, right? And so now coming to my own experience, if you add the two roles that I have with the role of my husband, who's also a founder of a tech company, in our household we have 3 businesses, we have 3 kids, and we also have a Siberian dwarf hamster who lives in our kitchen, and he's kind of running on his wheel, and it just, none of us wants to end up there, right? And so we kind of see, okay, what do we do? I think one solution that my husband and I found is one enabler was that we started our entrepreneurial journey in India. We also got our first kids there. So if you're in a country where you're different to everything else and everything else around you is different, we loved it, but we were also free from social norms. So you could actually set it up the way that you feel it's right. And that's a luxury that you can create by moving to a different country, or you're just trying to free yourself from these kind of expectations around you. I think a second thing is that we had 3 kids, so we had a bit of a learning curve. You could even say it's a hockey stick type of learning curve. So with kid number 1 and 2, we did have a couple of problems of sort of figuring out how the whole thing of sharing and caring works. And when our 3rd child was born, we kind of figured out how that works, how caring and sharing works. And from this time, I kept a little figure, Shiva, quite a famous Indian goddess with these many arms. And I have this statue on my table, because you do have to handle a lot of things. But the beautiful thing about Shiva is that he has one foot on the demon of ignorance and the other foot is dancing. And that's something that I see as my role model. I try to kind of, when it's getting really tough, try to remember the lightness of it. Maybe dance, maybe laugh, and kind of try to not take it so hard.
Absolutely. That sounds like a good balance and something to remember.
Sometimes.
And Suranga, you see this from the other side of the table.
Yep.
As a VC. So, when you sit down with a founder, when you sit down for a CEO, are they a hamster on a wheel or are they Shiva? What are the green flags you look for?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so first of all, I'm really glad that Ricarda was sharing the data there on the sort of, hard economic cost of well-being or not well-being. Because I think when people hear the phrase well-being, they often think it's this sort of soft, woolly, hard to define thing. And actually, it really isn't. Like it has a direct, economically measurable impact. We did a survey, as you mentioned at the beginning, of founders of tech startups, so over 250 different startups all over the world, and over 75% of those founders said that that they had a substantial lack of balance in the way that they sort of conducted their role, and over 2/3 of them said that they didn't think, but they knew that affected their performance. And as you said, if that's affecting your performance, at very least it means that your company's not achieving what it could achieve. At worst, it means your company stops. And so I think there's this real need to think about this. As a VC, I work for Balderton. We're a multi-stage firm. We often invest in companies as early as seed stage, sometimes much later. But usually when we're entering that relationship with a management team, with a CEO and their team, it's going to be a long-term relationship. Often the companies take 7, 8, sometimes 10 years to grow, and we're involved the whole way. And you're investing, therefore, in a marathon, right? You're investing in a long chunk of someone's life. You're not investing in a sort of transaction that's over in a year or in 6 months. And so we do take it very seriously to try and understand whether that founder is not just someone who loves, is passionate about the area they're working in, has built a great business and so on, but we also think, well, is this someone who can last the distance? Because we don't want to invest in someone who we think is going to burn out straight afterwards. And if we think that all the other boxes are checked and that one looks risky, then we often have that conversation with them about, is this a concern for you as well? And if it is, let's talk about fixing that and helping you manage that, even as we start to invest. So I think that's the key thing to realize with this, is that it has a real economic value. It's something which people often are aware of, but they don't, because we don't talk about it very much, it's not explicitly managed or addressed in the way that certainly I believe it should be.
Indeed, and you've been with Balderton for over a decade now, and I know previously you worked as a CEO, you were over in California, and in that period of time, how have you seen the conversations around well-being change? I know I was listening to a Bill Gates podcast where he was talking about in the early stages of Microsoft, he used to stand at the window, watch the car park, and make sure he was the last person to leave. Yeah. He used to compete with people to see how little he could sleep. Right. Have you seen a similar change? Because now he says, I love sleep. I know it's good for me. It helps with my decision-making, my risk awareness. Is that a reflection that you've seen as well? Yeah,
funnily enough, the last time I was at DLD was when I was still a CEO. So it was over 10 years ago now, which is embarrassing. I should have come back sooner because it's a great conference in a great town. But when I remember, if I think back to those days, my co-founder and I, he was the CTO, I was the CEO, we would always get very excited when we had a new product launch. And a big part of what would inevitably happen towards the end of a new product launch was that we'd start discussing whether it was going to be a one all-nighter or a 2 all-nighter or a 3 or 4 all-nighter launch. And it was always at least one, and often it was more. And there was a sort of machismo around that, and there was a kind of excitement around that. And reflecting on it, it's sad because really, if you plan your schedules well, you shouldn't have to do so much at such a last minute. I'm not really at all convinced that the product's going to be in great shape if you're doing that and sort of hallucinating in the last 3 or 4 days before the launch. And also, it's very exclusionary, right? I mean, it's the sort of thing that worked fine, given that at that time most of our team was under 30 and didn't really have any commitment outside work, and therefore they could stay all night and work on these things. But again, if you do that, then you're going to build a very certain kind of product that really only appeals to and works for a certain kind of person. And so, reflecting on that, it didn't really make sense. But I don't think we were unusual or particularly bad. I think it was actually very commonplace, and I think the Bill Gates comments echo that. I think today the mentality is completely different, and we see that even in our own portfolio. If you look at who we're investing in, the founders that we back today are much more diverse, not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of their backgrounds, what they did before, their age, their level of experience. And the more and more you get of more and more different people coming together and working on something together, I think you realize you have to accommodate the fact that people have other aspects to their lives. Not everyone is 24, just come out of university and has nothing except work to do. And I passionately think that if you do that, you actually build better products and therefore better companies. So the world has changed, but I think it's still, in the end, there is still this romanticism that's attached to this idea that you don't have to rest, and whoever works hardest will do the best, and it's just not true. I mean, it's sleep deprivation is literally a torture method used by armies around the world because people don't perform well if they don't sleep. So it's stupid to do it that way. It's actually, and I think other industries have figured this out a long time ago. If you talk to any elite sports person, they know absolutely the value and the importance of rest. They know that you can't, practice every day, and they know that break periods are as important as performance periods. So it's kind of sad to me that the technology industry, certain quarters of it, are still pushing this idea that you should bring a sleeping bag to the office.
Yeah, and Ricarda, I know you've got some, we've got applause in the front row. I know you've got some thoughts on sleep deprivation as well, working a lot with parents.
Yeah, so I mean, lack of sleep is probably a core field of expertise of parents, especially if you have babies at home. And so what I see is that this kind of lack of sleep actually, or kind of creates a skill. You become inherently resistant, and you realize that, yes, you can make it to the end of the day. Even if your baby is screaming, you will make it. So this inherent resilience that you feel is actually a skill set. And what we have developed is a matrix on how you can convert parenting skills or parenting experiences into leadership skills or life and leadership skills. And that is really beautiful because it gives the whole experience, the previous career mommer, a kind of a value that can be seen, and that are soft skills that also show up on the list of the WEF future skills, soft skills that we can't actually learn in a training, that you have to learn while you go. What doesn't really show up is multitasking. So multitasking, everybody knows it's the kind of the one skill that is attributed to working moms. It doesn't exist. It's unfortunately scientifically proven to not exist, which is a bit of a shame. So we decided to call it sequential single tasking with a parenting engine. So you kind of still do stuff and really fast, but it's something that companies start seeing. So large companies see it. They also have a bit of pressure to have their quotas fulfilled, or their lack of skilled labor is pushing them. But also startups actually see it, and they kind of increasingly position themselves as parent positive, and that I think is a very positive change.
Yeah, and Katja, Suranga spoke about exclusivity and inclusivity. I know that diversity is something you're incredibly passionate about. So when we talk about well-being initiatives, whether it's company policies or new benefits, do they need to be tailor-made to specific parts of the workforce moving forwards?
I definitely think so. Not only, when we look at diversity, but I really truly believe that the personality type, but then of course as well beyond personality type, what do we bring to the table, and to have. We all know that diverse teams just a lot more successful. Yet when I look at often leaders choose team members that are very much alike how they are. So, and I had a great conversation actually yesterday night at dinner with an amazing board member, and I think she's a speaker as well, and she said she chose a team that a lot of them are not alike her, and it's the first time, and how challenging it is, because of course, I mean, I understand my personality type and I can react to those fast, and it just costs a lot more reflection and listening skills, but I think that's what we need not only in the business environment, and I think if we tend to that towards a lot more, then we can take that learning outside the business world, and looking at that, we do not listen anymore and we don't discuss anymore. We argue right away when somebody has a different opinion. That's a huge problem when we look at the world right now. So I think I always look at where can we take those learnings, and we all have a private life outside of business life, and the more well we are in our business life, the better we thrive outside. And yeah, so diverse teams, it's a lot more work at the beginning, but it's an amazing learning curve as well, both for ourselves as well for the company.
Indeed. And so we started looking forward in that answer with, what needs to change, how do we keep up this momentum? So Suranga, I'll come to you as a VC, because often, a founder might be working by themselves, they might find it difficult to reach out to someone. As a VC, how can you better support, and how can other people in your position better support upcoming CEOs and founders?
Yeah, so I think the reality is that if you have the relationship that I do with management teams, for example, they, as close as you can be and as much as you work together, there is this sense that they know that you're their investor, that you sit on their board, and there is therefore a very natural fear around sharing any kind of weakness to me, right, or someone like me. And that's completely natural, and it would be odd if that didn't exist. And I think it's the same if you're a manager, right? If you're a manager and you have someone who reports to you, that person, the last thing they want to do usually is share that they're struggling with something. And I think it's really important if you're in that position, that you have people like that, that you make it okay to share those things. And so, at the firm, what we've done is, first of all, very formally create a program that helps CEOs think about the different ways in which they may want to balance their lives. So we started off with things around health and fitness, peer support, so basically being able to share the challenges of this very unique, very stressful job with other people who do the same job, because that's a very safe place to do it. And then also with things like coaching. But we're extending it I won't give away too much yet, but we're extending it in other ways to help on the side of the fact that many of our founders and CEOs have families, and that's a massive cause of both opportunity but also stress, and so how can we help that work, and so on. But then the other, so that's the formal side, but the informal thing is just making space for conversations where you talk about how are things going. So, most VCs sit on boards of companies that they invest in, and you have these very formal, very structured meetings where you turn up and, you read a bunch of documents, there's lots of spreadsheets, and everyone talks about strategy and business and everything else, and that's all great. But actually, sometimes the most important conversations are the lunch you have before the board meeting, one-on-one, or the coffee you have after the meeting, or even the chat you have on the way back to the airport, or whatever it might be, where, I now try very, very hard to divert off the inevitable business discussion and say, well, how's everything else going? And of course, for different people, it's different, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about family here, and as a dad myself, that's one of the key balances for me. But some of my founders, are not married, they don't have children, but there are other things that matter to them. It may be their parents, it may be their particular hobby, it might be some other passion they have, or whatever it might be. And the point is that people have these other things in their lives, and so opening up the conversation to talk about those so that it becomes okay to talk about that stuff as well as the job stuff. If you do that consistently, I think over time people start to trust you with that. And that's all you need. You just need to have that dialogue, right? Because that way, when something bad happens, there's an existing relationship you can lean on to figure out that in a holistic way. Whereas if you don't have that, and something big happens in someone's personal life, like a challenge with their child or a challenge in their marriage or whatever else, suddenly you're in this really difficult conversation, really awkward conversation, where someone you've known for years, but you don't even know their husband or wife's name, and now you have to talk about the fact that they might be getting divorced, and that's, I mean, if you get to that point, it's kind of too late to fix the problem, I think. So I think it's really important to try and open up the fact that we are three-dimensional people, not just one-dimensional and transactional, but you've got to invest to do that.
Absolutely. And Ricarda, what do you make of that? Where do you think the balance should be struck between, very practical policies and, like you say, the conversations so many of us have around the water cooler? How should that be met?
So, I would actually like to pick up on what you were saying about founders and how you support them, and maybe turn it into a business case.
Sure.
So if anyone of you is out there who is a founder and who's potentially going on parental leave, I think you should go for it. And if it's too late, then be an active parent now, because this is really something that is positive for the founders, but also for the VCs, as you said. And you could even, I would like to argue, a bit simplified, it's a burnout prevention, it's maybe a divorce prevention, and it's definitely a skills development exercise. And with that, it's a business case for both sides, and it's also a beautiful part of your life. And I think the combination is really worth it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think, as you've said really well, it protects against downside, but it also actually provides a lot of upside in form of resilience and skills, right? And I think that's what people miss. And the other thing that we discussed earlier, behind the stage, was that there are apparently still some VCs who write clauses into their funding documents that prohibit or limit parental leave in the founders or the CEOs of companies that they invest in. Which I'm still staggered to believe that. I can't believe that's the case. Certainly, it's not something we do, and I don't think we've ever done it. But if you are a founder and you have that kind of thing being written, I think there is actually now an environment where you can whistleblow that. You can talk about that, and I think we need to do that. We need to speak up about that kind of thing, because that's the only way you'll change it.
And Katja, a lot of this conversation, can revolve around when we talk about well-being, can come back to, who's the hardest, who can sleep in the office, who can pull an Elon Musk, sleep on a sofa and then eat a donut for breakfast. How does the language around well-being need to change moving forward so it just becomes a normal part of the conversation, and, not looking after yourself, becomes less of a badge of honor?
The language, that's when we're talking earlier, when you mentioned it about, building up the trust that, as you said, you're the investor, so I don't want to show you all my weaknesses, but to create that trusted environment, and it starts with a personal relationship, as you said, and it doesn't matter if you're the investor or the CEO or the team leader or the colleague. You have those kind of interactions, and how do we change the language? I don't know if it's necessarily the language or if it's the walk our talk. If I always send out emails on a Sunday afternoon, it's very hard to kind of, even though I tell my team you don't have to respond, but I still kind of create this environment and expectations. So to me it's more the behavior than the language, because then behavior as well probably brings the language with, or if colleagues or if those founders who promote that they can work with 4 hours sleep and they are so amazing, we just have to call it out and say, how long are you doing it, and is this really serious? And as long as we don't approach it, then nothing will change. But
I think you do have to be honest about the reality of it, right? If you're building a high growth company in a competitive sector, etc., there will be times when it will be without balance, right? And all three of us, I think, have experienced those moments. So it's not like you're saying you can always have that. And there are times when CEOs that I work with, I know, are surviving on too little sleep and should be doing other things and they're not doing it. But I think at least having that conversation so that they know and you know that it's happening, and you both therefore are sort of committing to it not being a long-term thing and being a short-term thing. That's the criticality of it. And so one of the things we did, which is, I agree that it's more about behavior than language, but one of the things we did was when we launched our program last year, we called it the Founder Wellbeing and Performance Program. And the reason we use those two words is because some people hear the well-being word, they understand what it means, they get it. I think everyone on this panel agrees with that, so they're happy, they're sold on the idea with that word. Others who are maybe still struggling a little bit with what well-being really is and whether it's something that they should be doing, given that some of their heroes don't seem to talk about well-being very much, they usually can latch onto the word performance. They usually, that tends to be the kind of binary split. So, and because I really think they are two sides to the same coin. So we use both words, and that way, if you're someone who likes to think about your performance, then fine. If that's what If that word makes you feel better about what you're doing, then and that leads to you looking after yourself, fantastic.
Reframe it that
go
way.
do that.
Yeah. And so far we've talked a lot, kind of peer-to-peer, founder to VC. But obviously you've all been leaders in your own rights. You have all been CEOs, and those conversations, can be very uncomfortable with your team and with members who might work for you. So, Ricarda, if you had a situation where you've identified. You're worried about a peer, how do you begin to have those conversations without it, turning into fears over performance?
Well, so I'm in a field where I'm surrounded by coaches, so it is a slightly different environment, I would say. But what definitely helps is talking about it and talking about your work culture, like what you were saying. In a corporate setting, you could say divide your work time and divide your private time, and this is how you do it, or have certain structures. In a startup field, it just doesn't work like this. So what we do is we set up tools, communication tools, very easy, Slack, stuff like that. But we talk about how we use it and how we communicate on them. Yeah. And we've actually developed something what we call a communication knigge. It's a kind of like a rule book on how to communicate with each other, and that we adjust all the time, because this is the only way on how you can sort of integrate agile new work tools and agile new work areas, and and also adjust your communication style to it. And I think that's something that is a work in progress and that constantly needs adjusting. So it's a process. I can't give you an end result to that. Yes.
And Suranga, I know when you were a CEO, you worked in California. Have you noticed a difference in how perhaps an American workforce might respond differently to a British workforce? Do you think it's that intrinsic, or are there kind of, some basic rules that can help everyone?
Yeah, I actually think there are basic rules that can help everyone. There's no doubt that that there is at very least a perception, and maybe to some extent a reality, that particularly in Northern California and Silicon Valley, around the technology industry, there's a lot of hard work and a lot of commitment to work. A lot of people go to that region from all over the world because they want to do one thing, which is start or join, a high growth technology startup. And so that's why they're there, and that when they are there, if it's working, they're going to work very hard at it. But I actually think, we across Europe, not just the UK, but across Europe, that culture has seeped into everything else. So we've heard on a number of panels today, people compare Europe and Munich and Bavaria specifically to Silicon Valley and so on. And when those comparisons happen, usually it's a very one-way comparison, and it's one where people talk about how Silicon Valley's ahead, we're all behind, how can we catch up? That's kind of always the conversation. And one of the things I keep saying is, no, I think it's a two-way conversation. I really do. And I think if you look at Europe collectively, historically, it's a place where a lot of really impressive things have happened. People have built really important organizations. They've created and nurtured some of the most important ideas that still affect the lives of everyone around the planet. And yet we also, I think, as a culture, have a sense of how to balance things. And so I think this is something which we can actually bring to the conversation, and it can be slightly less one way than maybe sometimes these conversations are.
Wonderful. Well, I would say that's a very useful note to leave it on. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. I shall leave you in the hands of Steffi.